Hello and good afternoon, and welcome to the first online event for the Nottingham Tech for Good Festival. My name is Paul Bailey. I'm part of the team behind the festival, and which started off as just a bit of an idea at the end of October, and it's now blossomed into a 4-day celebration of how technology is being used for a force for good and for positive change. Throughout this week, we'll be exploring 7 key themes, which cover everything from responsible AI and data to sustainability and digital inclusion. We've got over 20 events taking place across 7 venues across the city. And so far, over 500 people have signed up to attend, which is absolutely fantastic. And the purpose of this festival, in many ways, is around sparking ideas and making connections and asking some of the questions that we're all facing. You know, what's going to happen around AI? What's going to happen with ethics? How can we innovate but be kind to the planet at the same time? So if you're here as a technologist or as a creative or a designer or a policymaker or a student or simply somebody who's curious about tech for good, what that really means, then you're in the right place. I'm really pleased to say today we've got Stuart Reeves from the University of Nottingham. He's going to share some really fascinating research that he's been doing into what happens when robots go public. We have got Q&A, so if you want to ask Stuart any questions as we go through the session, feel free to add those questions into the Q&A panel, which is should be on the right of your screen. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Stuart.
Great, thank you very much. Hopefully you can see my slides. So my name's Stuart, and I'm an academic in the School of Computer Science at the University of Nottingham. And this work that I'm going to be talking about, we've been doing with a lot of other people that are listed on this slide. I won't go through in detail, but it's kind of a project that involves various other institutions and organisations across the world. So my talk's about what happens when robots go public. And the first thing to say is that, robots are being deployed into public places across the world. And I guess a question for the audience is, if you see, whether you've seen any of these robots in public places and what you've actually seen. I've got some examples that I can give. Here we've got a whole range of different types of robots that are operating in public spaces. So we've got the research type systems. So that's the top right. There's a automated rubbish bins that are moving around in a kind of cafe area, offering people to use them so they can put their rubbish in. That's a research project. Below that is a autonomous shuttle. So this is a transport shuttle that works between various different points, like any kind of bus, but it's fully autonomous, although there is a safety driver inside. On the bottom right, you've got delivery robots. These are ones in, I think, Los Angeles, Serve Robotics, delivering food from a kitchen or takeaway or wherever it is to a customer. And you've got other things like security robots you can see down the bottom in the middle being depicted here. And then also, in kind of more quasi-public spaces, things like airport robots that are used to carry luggage and stuff like that. So these sorts of robots are being put out into the real world in many different sorts of places. Now, the important thing to note is that, fairly obviously, public places are really complex. And what we're interested in our research was how public places like the street, urban environments, as kind of collectives of kind of people, vehicles, shops, pavements, trees, all this kind of stuff, how those sorts of things as kind of a complete whole deal with these robots that are being placed in these public spaces and operating in them. And we're also interested in our research in terms of what the implications are for human-robot interactions, for the design and engineering of these robots, but also their governance and regulation. Now, I should just say, my background is a computer scientist, but essentially I do a bunch of kind of sociological work. And so we're kind of interested in how our studies and the way we do studies, which I'll describe in a minute, connects with those sorts of areas and fields. So already sort of indicate there's a big kind of emerging class of public robots that's happening. Our studies in particular, although we have looked at others and I'll talk about them later, our studies in particular focused on Starship Technologies robots, which you can see depicted here in one of their sort of ad images. For those who don't know about this, these are robots which are running in various cities in the UK, and have been since 2018 or so. And you get an app, and you go to a shop on the app. So whether it's a grocery shop or like a local takeaway, anything that's providing food via this app or groceries via this app, you specify what you want, you purchase it, and then you say where you want it delivered. And then the robot eventually will turn up. It will be dispatched from the vendor and then show up to the customer, to you as the customer. So that's what you can see depicted here, this person picking some food out of one of these robots. Now, I already said that public spaces are complex. That should be no surprise to anyone who goes into any kind of urban environment on a regular basis. I've got a picture here of the Shibuya crossing. This is in Japan. This is kind of like a classic complex environment, and there's kind of a few things that we can sort of say about this. Robots are being deployed to these sorts of places where they're very busy, there's lots of people moving around, and people are kind of crossing the road here, and they're somehow managing to get from A to B without bumping into each other, without tripping over stuff generally, and generally sort of unproblematically getting from one place to another. And what we're doing when we're deploying robots is we're putting them into these sorts of complex spaces where there's lots of social interactions going on. The other aspect I want to raise about this is our particular perspective. This is kind of like a bird's eye view of what's going on, a top-down view. But what we like to do is to try and look at what's happening at street level for members of the street themselves. And to give you a kind of flavour of what that looks like, I've got a bit of video here that I'm going to play of one of these robots roaming around. I think it's Northampton, going from one place to another. I think we were following one of these robots. We have done some orders ourselves. I'm just going to let the video play, and I'm going to mention things as we go along. So the robot's driving down the pavement. It's kind of veering slightly leftwards, and then it kind of goes rightwards a bit around this kind of post. And there's a couple of people who are up ahead, and they're kind of going past this lamppost. So you can watch it again. So the robot's driving towards them. They're sort of looking ahead, and then they're forming into a kind of a moving queue of two, and they're sort of squeezing past this post as they go about doing it. Now, when we look at robots on the street, this is the kind of thing we see all the time happening, right? We can say a few things about what's going on here. The robot actually stops at this point, by the way, as well, and then it kind of carries on. These people who are walking past this robot seem to anticipate some kind of problem or trouble, that they will need to make space or yield space for this robot. You can see them aligning themselves very fluidly into this kind of queue that goes on the very small part of the pavement next to the post. The robot itself just kind of drives almost towards the post and then kind of veers rightwards a bit, and then stops, and then probably it's sensing proximity of something nearby, an obstacle, and then carries on after that. So that's the kind of thing that we're looking at when we're talking about robots and understanding what's going on the street. Now, we did a bunch of field work from which this video is drawn, looking at these sorts of robots out in various places. Now, specifically, we looked at Northampton and Milton Keynes, but they are in other cities and kind of urban and suburban environments in the UK. Now, I should also mention, although we focused on Starship robots, you don't really care particularly about Starship robots per se. There's nothing kind of necessarily special about them, and it could really apply to any kind of robot in a public space. It just so happens that Starship operate in Milton Keynes and Northampton and Leeds and all sorts of other places. So I described how they work to begin with. There's a vendor who supplies goods via the robots, and then there's an app which you use to purchase these, and then the robot is the mediating thing. There's a bunch of infrastructure behind the scenes that we don't know about. So field workers, people who are maintaining the robots, people who are like monitoring them, intervening when there's problems, all that kind of stuff. We don't know much about that. All we're really looking at so far is the street level stuff, and to some extent the vendors. We've done about kind of 7 days worth of data collection. We've been to, as I said, Northampton, Milton Keynes, been to Newport Pagnell, which is kind of part of Milton Keynes. And this ranges from, summer through to winter through to springtime, over various years worth. And we've got quite a lot of video in our collection. What does our video look like? Well, you've seen a little bit of it already. We have, when we're doing this kind of work, we've normally got a couple of field workers, researchers, and we're trying to capture kind of a wide angle and a kind of more focused following angle. So we've used GoPros and mobile phones to do this. In order to capture them, these robots, and because we're kind of hanging out on the street, we've had kind of opportunistic and intentional methods. So we've both found robots where they're hanging out and followed them opportunistically, and we've also set orders up and run with those orders, and followed them and then captured that process itself. The other thing to note about our field work and the way we go about doing this is we sort of treat our collection of video data itself as a kind of useful method for understanding what's going on. So when you start to try and video record these things moving around space, you suddenly become aware of things like how their mobility is, so how they move in space, and the kind of the very alien ways in which they go from A to B compared to people. We'll see this in a video clip in a bit. So you're simultaneously kind of trying to run to catch up with them, but you're also coming to a stop for quite some time, hanging around waiting for them to make their next move. And so just even the act of trying to video record these things helps sensitize you to what kind of, as I said, sort of different kinds of mobility these things have, and how that then fits into the kind of organization and order of the street, and how people are moving about in space and navigating from A to B. The other thing I need to say about this is, when we're doing this kind of field work, we're constantly reflecting on what's going on. Like, oh, is it going to go down this way? Oh, why is it stopped now? Is it going to get up this curb? All this kind of stuff. So again, you get this kind of thing where you can start to kind of think about things that people might be sort of reasoning about when they're seeing these robots out in space. The other thing to say is, and I won't talk about this much in this presentation, but in addition to this kind of on-street fieldwork, we've started to talk to vendors, so people who are supplying goods via these robots. So you can see at the bottom, 4 pictures are pictures from, a fish and chip shop, a takeaway, like a corner shop, and then a kind of larger grocery chain, which is the Co-op. They're partnered with Starships. They provide goods. And we're interested also in the kind of the different ways that the vendors are using these. Some of them use them alongside other delivery services. Some of them are using only the robots as a kind of special delivery service. And also kind of how the vendors need to kind of reason about the timing of things, if their food is hot or cold, what that enables them to actually do at what times, how they assemble orders, etc., etc. In order to contextualize what we're doing in our research, we've, when someone picks up, as you can see me doing, picking up an order, the vendor's packing it, and you're on the receiving end of that. And we're our research really is about kind of what happens in that journey in between. Now, in the media and in the kind of popular imagination about these sorts of robots, the journey in between tends to be characterized mainly in terms of these two sorts of things. So we have robots being abused or some kind of conflict occurring with them, or we've got robots being helped. And those are kind of two extremes of activity which we see reported on, as I said, typically in the media around what's happening on the street with these robots. And we obviously did see this when we did field work. So very occasionally, very occasionally, we saw someone messing around with a robot. So for example, here's someone who's grabbing an antenna on the robot and pushing it down as they move past, right, in a kind of somewhat aggressive way. We also see people helping them. Again, not all the time, but occasionally we see people helping them. So here you can see someone who's passing a crossing. A robot is waiting for the lights to change, or waiting to be able to cross, and it takes quite a while to do so. And this person pushes the button, and then they carry on their way. So they are not crossing the road; they're actually helping the robot. So we do see these two extremes of activity related to human-robot interactions. But for the most part, what we see is way more subtle than that, and that's these kind of tiny micro interactions that are occurring all the time between people and robots. So in order to unpack some of this, we kind of started to look at what we call walking trajectories around or alongside robots. So if you imagine thinking back to the Shibuya Junction, That should be a crossing. We've got people going from A to B. They're engaging in the kind of trajectories of walking, going from one point to another. They're not hitting each other. They're somehow going from one point to another successfully, crossing past each other, following each other, intersecting with each other, and everything's all good. And so we were interested in kind of what that means when you put a robot into that sort of environment and that sort of phenomena of encounter, as we call them. So in particular, we've looked at three sorts of forms of this. So what happens when people are following or overtaking the robot, what happens when they're passing by robots, and what happens when they cross paths with robots. So I've got videos to illustrate this, and I'll just play this video and talk over it. So we've got someone who's following a robot. You can see my colleague is actually one of the people videoing, and she's sort of standing there in the black coat. This person is following the robot, and the robot's driving along, and then eventually at some point it stops, right? And then you can see a zoomed in view. So it's driving along. This person's kind of keeping distance carefully. It stops. They almost sort of trip over. And then they're kind of looking for a way to overtake, essentially. And then they eventually do. They move over to the crossing and overtake the robot. So when people are walking behind these robots, we see this kind of quite often, as I mentioned earlier. Their mobility is unusual. A lot of the time, it's not problematic, but sometimes it is problematic. Something to note about this is the nature of being on a street and being in a flow of traffic, right? So this is what this kind of highlights to us. When we're walking behind people, we're not just walking behind another person. We're also in a kind of queue, a flow of people, and there's a sense in which that's what our activity is. Now, robots like this, they don't really have that sense of kind of what a flow of people is. They don't have a sense of someone's following me, and I need to be cognizant of what's going on and the implications of if I stop here, what will happen to that person behind us. So that's the kind of something that we kind of highlight related to the robots when we kind of look at the clips a bit like this. So in addition to kind of following, we also might pass by robots, and so we see different forms of this. I'm only really giving very limited examples, but here's just one example of what it's like passing by one of these robots and some of the strategies people use to get past them. So here we can see a robot driving towards a curb. It's driving towards a curb to go to the crossing. There's three people who we see as kind of together. So that's another thing, important thing to say. It's not just three individuals. It's three people who are related in some way, and we can see that when we look at what their activities are. So the robot's driving towards them, and they form this kind of bulge or bubble around the robot. One of them actually switches hands and then kind of runs to kind of catch up or move faster to catch up. But they're basically accommodating, yielding space, making space around this robot. And again, like the earlier clip I showed, there's various judgments that people must be making about how close they can go to a robot. Will it sense them? What's an appropriate distance to use? And so we see this in the kind of our clips about how people make these on-street judgments, momentary judgments about what they're going to do about this thing that's kind of approaching them. The robot itself is just driving towards the curb and then stops. I guess it probably detects some kind of obstacle and then carries on. And essentially, all the people are kind of doing all the work here to make space for this robot. The last example I've got, which is quite detailed and complex. There's a lot of stuff going on. We've got a robot that's heading towards a crossing, effectively. This is as you can see, it's Milton Keynes. This is a shopping centre in Milton Keynes, and this robot is driving towards an entrance. And as you'd imagine with any entrance for any building, there's the possibility that people may go in and come out. So you may hit intersecting traffic. So this robot is driving towards, there's three people, there's one kind of in a white shirt, and there's two other people crossing here. I'll just let the video play again as it carries on. So the first person in the black top, who's walking, the woman who's walking leftwards, I think the robot seems to stop based on that crossing. And then what's interesting is this person here, this man here on the right-hand side, who is stopping and yielding, waiting for the robot. It's very, very subtle, but essentially the robot stops. There's a moment where he's stopping, and it's like, who's going to go first? There's a sort of turn taking here, like who gets to go first across the crossing, across the intersection here that is formed outside this shopping centre. And you'll see, so if you look very carefully, he's waiting, the robot waits, and he waits around the same time. The robot does not respond to that, what is essentially an offer for space to be taken up. You can go first. And then he just carries on anyway. But then the robot also drives towards him. So the point here is to say that when robots are kind of entering these sorts of public spaces, they're entering into social systems, such as like a turn-taking system of, who goes first, who yields for who has the right to go first. We have other clips, for example, where we've got, robots passing by buggies, people pushing buggies, and, they're having to make space for this robot sometimes because of the various kind of the fact that it kind of becomes an obstacle in space. We can contrast what we've seen there with kind of how robots are designed to see the street, or at least how we think they are. This is from the point of view of the stuff we have been told or know about. So there's a link on here to a Medium article by one of the people who's developing some of the navigation related to these robots in particular. Again, it's not about Starship robots per se. This is about general robotics and how people in robotics are designing and engineering robots, right? So I don't want to kind of single out Starship as somehow different to any other kind of company making or organization making robotics or robots. But the way that they now do this navigation, and as a service, it works. It's been running since 2018 and it is by all accounts successful. On the left-hand side, we can see how they map out the street. So here, street goes from being a street to a series of nodes in a graph, essentially. And we can see green ones and red ones and purple ones. The red ones are crossings and the purple ones are driveways, I think. And essentially, there's a series of waypoints you can see depicted here on the little animation on the right that the robot is attempting to navigate via. So it's trying to hit all these different waypoints. That's its form of navigation. And we can kind of contrast that with kind of how people are dealing with this form of navigation, this form of the way robots see things around them, with how people are kind of managing that. So this leads to kind of a way of thinking about this issue. And now there's a robot-centric view, which essentially sees humans and human activity largely as kind of obstacles. And instead, we're kind of thinking about more of a human-centric view. So what's it like for the people involved in this street environment? Well, not all the time, but certainly some of the time, the robot essentially becomes an obstacle, or they're accommodating it and they're working on ways to stop it from bumping into them, or yielding for it, whatever it might be. In addition to people, we also looked at kind of objects, because objects on the street are traces of human activity. So I've got just two examples here. We can see bins on the right-hand side, and we can see scaffolding on the left-hand side. So it's obviously bin day, the bins have come out, and the robot is, having to navigate in this kind of effectively like an obstacle course of these bins that could be anywhere potentially. On the left-hand side, we've got kind of robots trying to go through scaffolding. Scaffolding's probably been up for several months or whatever. So these traces of human activity are everywhere on the street. If you think about a cafe that puts out a sign or something like that, that'll be a different kind of temporality, different pattern of deployment of that object. And the purpose of that object as well. So, bins are only there for probably a day or so. Scaffolding might be there for several months, but they're both temporary in various ways. And so there's this kind of range of objects on the street which form what we'd call a streetscape that the robot also has to kind of deal with, which are human activity traces. I'm just going to switch things slightly to go, well, that's our research on robots in the UK. We've also been looking at research on doing research on robots in other countries. So we need to kind of broaden sort of our understanding of robots. As I said, that I talked about a broad class of public robots. And here we can see a different kind of delivery robot. So we've got the Starship one on the left for size comparison, an autonomous vehicle on the right, I think a Waymo vehicle. And then we've got these ones in China, which are being used on various kind of university campuses in a trial form, which are delivery robots for parcels. So they'll drive up to a courtyard and people come down and collect their parcel. Now, the different thing about these sorts of robots we've been looking at is that they drive on the roads and they drive in shared spaces. So spaces where pedestrians and people and cars can, and cyclists and cars can go. And they are quite different to these small Starship robots, which only drive on pavement. So when we're thinking about robots in public, as I said before, we need to consider all this kind of all these different dimensions to the different kind of qualities they have, the different consequences that different sizes and so on of robots can have on the street. So just to give you a flavor of this, when we've been looking at these robots, this is the kind of spaces they're operating in. You can see there's people, there's cyclists, there's people on mopeds, there's cars, and they're navigating from A to B. And so they have all these sorts of differences, but some similarities with these delivery robots. So, for example, the size of the robot presents a different has a different quality to it. So a robot of this size that also goes at this speed can be a bit threatening to people. They're large, right? They're almost as big as you. If they hit you, it's gonna hurt. So people have to adapt to that, which is different to the pavement robots. The speed, as I mentioned, is very different. So there's a different sense of kind of what it means to be in a flow. Here we're talking about a flow of cars, pedestrians, cyclists, motorcycle riders, and so on. So here, we have pedestrians who are having to step aside because this thing is a lot faster than them, but people who are cycling or on motorbikes or cars want to overtake this thing because it's too slow. So there's a very different character to different sorts of, immediately when you have a different size of robot, it changes all sorts of consequences on the street. And then this particular robot uses sound announcements. So it asks to pass or tells people to kind of keep some distance away. It has sort of like warning sounds. And we found, the Starship robots don't have this. They don't have sound really, per se. But these robots, because they're going faster, the designers have decided to use sound alerts. And interestingly, people kind of either they may well treat them as relevant, these announcements, but they can also completely ignore them. They're just noise, right? They're not addressed to anyone in particular. So again, this is kind of something that, thinking about the sociality of the street comes in handy. Just to close, in addition to kind of field work and empirical work like this, we've also been thinking about design and design of public places and how public robots relates to the design of places. So I'm just referencing a book here, The Social Life of Small Urban Spaces by William White. This is a classic study of New York plazas and what makes them good or bad as public spaces. And we've taken a lot of inspiration for this about thinking, well, equivalently, what would make something a good public space for a robot or not a good public space for a robot? And, we've got to think about the nature of places being made actively by people. And so we sort of started to put together sort of ways of thinking about what factors people developing or adopting robots should consider. And as I said, this is kind of taking into account a wider range of robots, not just the delivery robots, but other sorts of robots as well. And we've got a kind of framework. I'm not going to go into tons of detail on this. This is on our website, so you can have a look at it at your leisure. But I'll just talk a little bit about it. So we've started to develop this kind of framework for essentially kind of trying to bring together all these kind of issues which people will need to think about when they're thinking about public robots. And it looks complicated, but the paper describes it in detail and our website describes it in a bit more detail. But we've kind of got 4 different aspects that relate to robots in public: localism, environment, activities, and sociability. So for example, I'll just give a couple of examples. So for example, when we think about environment, the environment that the robot is in or being operated within has a huge effect on what's going on. So we know probably about familiar examples like snow, for instance, but there might be all sorts of other objects in space, like I mentioned, the streetscape, which change all the time and change across different sorts of activities. So with activities, we think about any given public space, maybe there's a festival on, maybe there's a regular thing that's occurring that actually means that loads of people are suddenly there, or maybe certain times of day are very busy. When we're thinking about robots in public, we need to think about these sorts of features of those public spaces. So as I said, we put together some sort of attempt to kind of try and bring some of those factors together in a kind of structured way of thinking. So if you're interested in that, let's have a look at our paper. I've just got a few concluding things to talk about in closing. So one of the things that's we've pondered a lot in this project and our research is what happens when new operators enter public spaces. So we see what happens when there's one, but what happens when there's more than one? And I think a lot of that is kind of unclear as to kind of what's going to happen, whether that should happen, how you deal with that, who's responsible, all this kind of stuff. Another aspect which we've been pondering is kind of, I guess, related to the autonomous vehicles discussion but perhaps more so. Public and private activities. So delivery robots and other sorts of robots that operate in public spaces may well be kind of doing private stuff in the sense of like they're delivering goods to a given consumer, etc. But they're using public spaces. So there is some sense of a blurring of these two sort of operating spaces. At the same time, people in some of these cities, they feel proud that they have these very advanced, futuristic robots going around, and it's kind of part of their civic life. It's changing the nature of their public spaces. So I think there's quite a lot of rethinking, or at least clarification, needs to go on in terms of issues around, and I don't have the answers to this, issues around things like ownership, who owns these, and for whose purpose should they operate overall. I mentioned this already. We have a website, which I'll put up at the end again. If you want to look at materials, we have lots of video clips, which we put online, anonymized video clips. And what we're interested in doing is creating resources for other people to use. So if we're talking to sort of designers of robots, we want to also be able to share materials that help them rethink things, respecify things, ideate stuff in a way that is more sensitive to human needs and also human nature and what's going on out there in public. We've also been talking to people developing standards. So the Urban Robotics Foundation is developing an ISO standard. So this very much relates to that first question around what happens when there's lots of operators in public spaces operating these robots. What happens? How do we manage that? What standards should they adhere to? And finally, we're continuing this work with a new project, which is starting, or has just started, which is with the Swedish innovation agency Vinnova, which is actually working with various partners to look at a rollout of these delivery robots in Stockholm. And that's the end of my talk. You can go to our website, have a look at the information. There's a bunch of papers you can read if you really want to, but there are web pages for those papers which summarize some of the details as well.
Great. That was really interesting, Stuart. If you want to ask Stuart a question, you just want to drop it into the Q&A, and I'll kick off with one. I'm really curious because I guess this is quite new territory. I guess what surprised you when you were doing your research? What were the things that maybe you didn't anticipate when you begun the research, and it kind of surprised you once you started actually studying this kind of everyday interaction?
Yeah, so I think one thing that I guess maybe it's not surprising, but it was not something I thought about, but became extremely obvious, and I guess is sort of surprising, is actually that most of the time people are just getting on with things and they're not paying attention largely to these robots. They're just going about their business. People have got their own little projects they're doing essentially. So again, it's very obvious in retrospect, but before that, I had not even thought about how important that was. So it's surprising in that sense, in the sense of as I said, people are just getting on with what they need to do, and actually, it's the other surprising thing is how important those tiny little interactions are. We would argue that it's really those tiny little interactions, those micro interactions, which are enabling public spaces to be amenable to these robots. So really, we like to kind of go back to people and center people, because we're always centering technology all the time and robots and AI and whatever it might be. Instead, we need to kind of, I think, relentlessly, we need to kind of go back and center people all the time. And so centering people, people are really skilled at judging and managing themselves in public spaces. And, I haven't talked about it, but there's all sorts of different people out in public space that have different kinds of mobility, right? Different ways they get from A to B, and of engaged in all sorts of different work. For example, we have a window cleaner who has an encounter with one of these robots. He's getting on with his job, right? So I think those tiny little interactions and the significance of them was one of the other surprising things, I guess, that again I didn't think about before we started.
Yeah, I can understand that. Like, humans are quite difficult to predict, aren't they? We've got a good question from Cassandra. It's quite a long one, so I'm going to read it very carefully. With China aggressively pursuing deployments, figure trialing robots in the home and BMW, and the cost of production reducing by apparently 30% over the last 12 months. What kind of price point do you think where humanoid robots have to reach before they become viable in UK industries?
Okay, so I get an opportunity to share my spicy opinions about humanoid robots. I mean, I would say just on the humanoid point. I mean, so what I would say. Okay, so firstly, I'll say as I said earlier, the robots that are doing these deliveries, they work. The service works, right? It's generally like works quite well. Um, um, but they're also using very basic, and this is not a criticism, very basic kinds of technology that's reliable because you're out on the street, it's rainy or windy. Um, it's a tough environment in Northampton, right? It's gritty, right? Um, so the other thing it sensitizes you is to the nature of kind of actual reality. It's really harsh, right? And so what I would say about kind of any robots that are actually operating is the environment is super harsh. You have no idea until you look at it, right? And so when people talk about humanoid robots, I guess I roll my eyes a little bit because people who are making humanoid robots, they're trying to do probably the hardest thing first, which is replicate what people do. And as we look at our videos and see what people are really doing, they are so skilled. People are so skilled. There's a video clip I've got of like some tiny negotiation that someone's doing to skirt around a robot, and you can sort of see their knee movements and how their knee movements project a certain way they're going to get around this thing, right? And they're kind of like carefully crafting their activity, their bodily activity and comportment and everything to kind of just get from one place to another and avoid this kind of obstacle that's suddenly appeared. So I think when you start looking at human action, you realize the scale of the challenge, and then you also realize how the ones that do operate, how sturdy and hardy they need to be to even work at all. So it's not really a good answer, right? But I think it's a lot harder than you think, basically, like way harder. Forget the hype.
So we all the kind of YouTube videos of the Boston Dynamics kind of humanoid type robots, we can kind of ignore that for now.
They're just demo videos. I mean, it's very impressive. I mean, don't get me wrong. It's really impressive engineering, really, really impressive engineering. But I mean, yeah, the world is a harsh place. It's a really harsh place. So yeah, I think they're way far off. It's hard enough, I think, for even just those operators that are working with these kind of. There's a reason why wheeled robots have been successful, I think, I would say.
Yeah, and I guess the more complicated they make them, the more things can go wrong.
Exactly.
The more maintenance they need, the more power. Yeah. I don't think we've got any other questions so far. I'll just give people a couple of minutes in case they do have one last question before we wrap things up.
There is a question about what capabilities I believe are the next major breakthroughs needed for robots to become truly integrated and accepted as social partners in society.
Great.
So I can answer that.
Sorry. I didn't see that.
What I would say is on that, I guess building up on that note, I mean, what I would say is with the thinking about robots in public and on the street, a critical thing is planning beyond two levels, which is there's one level which is I'm going from A to B, right? That's a route finding problem that's been explored a lot in computer science. Obviously, that has its challenges, but that's the problem. Then there's the kind of immediate I'm avoiding an obstacle problem or detecting, even using computer vision to detect there's a person here or there's an animal or whatever, right? That's another level. That's kind of obstacle avoidance. But there's a middle level which is about, there's something going down on the street over there occurring. I'm going to cross the road over here, right? That's a kind of anticipatory level of kind of planning, reaction, response, and then it's also part of a feedback cycle where you're also impacting what other people are doing in space. That space is incredibly challenging social navigation. I think people normally refer to it as. I recently looked at a literature review on this. That space is completely untapped largely. There's work going on in it, but it's super, super hard. So I think even just thinking purely in terms of route planning, there's masses of that major breakthroughs are needed just to do that stuff.
We've got an interesting question. It's from an anonymous user, but they were asking how many robots have been damaged or vandalized, and have any of the goods inside been stolen?
Good question. I'm not a representative for Starship Technology, so you'd have to ask them. But when I've heard them talk about it, they generally say yes, it happens. So yeah, robots do get vandalized, and occasionally they get broken into, but they sort of seem to say it does happen, but it's happened less than they imagined it would happen or something. So take what you want from that. I mean, ultimately, I guess ultimately they're kind of, what's in them is very low cost and low value, and also there's the robots themselves are very sort of specialist, and there's not, yeah, they're very unusual objects. So yeah.
A question about capabilities. What capabilities do you believe are the next major breakthrough?
Oh no, I just answered that. I just answered that one, I think.
Is that the same? Oh, there's another one. Sorry, I'm not very good at Q&A. There's a question about design elements. What design elements such as appearance, movement, and responsiveness are most crucial in fostering trust and acceptance of robots in social settings like public spaces? We see four-legged dog-shaped delivery robots. Is this for utility or to gain acceptance from the community?
So I'm going to talk a little bit just briefly about the notion of acceptance and trust. So people in robotics often, or HRI, often use the term acceptance. But I think actually one of the things our research talks about really is how we need to see this as a kind of quite complex service that involves many stakeholders. So, for example, we've not really talked about local councils. We've not talked about people who are local who may have some engagement with councils about, we're deploying robots to your area or whatever. We've not talked about kind of the infrastructure, as in like, building pavements and all that kind of stuff, the local kind of physical infrastructure. So I think one way of thinking about it, one way that, people in HRI tend to think about things in terms of acceptance, but I think I'd actually kind of push back a little bit against that and say it's more about understanding this as I guess more of a traditional kind of UX type approach of thinking about multiple stakeholders involved in the delivery of these sorts of services in the first place, and who's involved. Because you can imagine that, let's just say, a council wants to deploy its own special delivery service for, I don't know, to medical stuff, right? Medical results or whatever it might be, medical sample. I don't know. I'm just making something up at the moment. That completely changes the nature of what those robots objects are in space for people when they know what they are, right? It changes the character of them and the way people would treat them, right? You can imagine something that is seen to be part of a public service, people will probably treat quite differently to something that's part of just someone delivering groceries, right? So I think when we think about acceptance, as I said, we need to think bigger than just the object itself, but think more widely about who's it for, what's the purpose, who owns it, who's it, benefiting, and that stuff.
Yeah, and I guess that's quite a challenge, isn't it? Because I imagine every location you've got to go through that process again.
Yeah.
We've got time for one last question, I think. What are your thoughts about integrating and the impact of robots in public in a life-centered design sense?
I'm not sure what life-centered design sense is. I guess it maybe relates back to what I was saying, which is I think, I would. It's a multi-stakeholder issue. I think we could think, a given company should start operating in robots in a public space, but that hasn't happened, and it can't happen for various reasons. You've got to engage with local governance. You've got to think about standards increasingly, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's the whole stuff around vendors. We haven't really talked about that. We start to do research with vendors, and there's one service that's actually serving different kinds of shops, and there's a character to each of those sorts of services. Like, are you receiving something that's hot food or cold food, right? Is it something that's like, that you need now, or it doesn't matter when you get it. So there's all those sorts of considerations that we've not made. How does it fit into vendors' operations? Is it just one other service? Is it actually being prioritized or deprioritized, and etc.
Well, just wanted to thank you, Stuart, firstly. It's only like people like yourself that have made the Tech for Good Festival possible by giving up your time, and really interesting to hear a lot more about the research that you've been doing in this space. Really curious about that human interaction, and I'll be keeping my eyes out for the next kind of robot delivery that hopefully will be safely coming my way in the next few years. If you are interested in more talks like this, you check out the rest of the schedule, which is www.nt4g.org/schedule. You can still book in sessions for the rest of the week after today. But again, thank you very much, Stuart, and hopefully see you all again soon.
Thank you.
Cheers.